Hey there, welcome to the Goodlife Community Church podcast. It's so good to have you join us. For 8 weeks, we're doing the Practicing the Way of Jesus course by John Marcoma and his team. It's a blueprint on spiritual formation and becoming a disciple of Jesus. You can find extra resources at practicingtheway.org. I really hope that you can lean in and discover with us what it means to follow Jesus as a way of life and see formation integrated into our church and into us individually.
Well, here we are in the 5th week of our series that we're doing based on the book Practicing the Way of Jesus by John Marcoma. And I just want to say I'm really encouraged by so much of the feedback that I'm hearing from the groups that have formed and existing groups that have been going, who have been working their way through this material. But this is not just an exercise in working our way through material. This is an exercise that's literally about positioning ourselves to experience God, to allow God to work in us, to shape us and to form us. With these 3 goals in mind is what the point of the series has been about. It's been to be with Jesus, to know what it means to be in God's presence, to become like Jesus, not just know about Jesus. And then the third is what? Someone said it down here, to become. We want to become the kind of people that Jesus wants us to be. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about pain and suffering and the way that God can use that in our life. Because if you haven't worked this out yet in life, pain and suffering seems to be an inevitability and something that sometimes we don't have a lot of control over that happens in this world around about us. I want to ask you this morning, and I'd like to see a show of hands if we can, and that is, have you ever prayed anything that resembled something like this? God, please don't let this happen. It's like a Mexican wave. Please don't let this happen. Now, this is normally a preemptive prayer where you see something may happen. And it's the kind of pain and suffering that you don't want to come into your life. And it's something kind of like you're driving down the road and you see a van on the side of the road and it's dark blue. And your wife says to you, how fast are you going at the moment? And you're like, and you look down and you're like, I'm doing 82. And you go into this stress and this panic as you drive past the van where it said on the side, police surveillance or, whatever, that they've got a camera and that they're catching people speeding. This may have happened to me last night, potentially. And so we went to someone's house for dinner and it was just like this low-level feeling over the time. I was trying to ignore it, of like, And I'm like, I don't even remember seeing the sign. I don't know if it was 60. I don't know if it was 70. I don't know if it was 80. I'm really hoping it was 100. And so we got back in the car afterwards, and we're driving back home, and I'm driving at a lower speed, and as we go around the corner, I see the sign, and it said 80, and I'm like, oh, phew, surely they won't get me for a couple of Ks over. But you never know, right? That's the kind of type of pain and suffering where we experience the pain of getting a consequence in our life because of a choice that we've made. Now, there are different types of pain and suffering. There are those that suffering or pain comes into our life because we've made choices. We've made decisions whether we did those deliberately, so we were, completely aware of what we were doing, and yet we went, and we did it anyway, and then things didn't turn out, or we played the risk game, where we went, it'll be fine, and then it turned out to not be fine. We do that sometimes with things like sun cream and the sun and skin cancer. Why is everyone quiet here in Queensland? So you get these messages. They've been happening for me since the 80s. slip, slop, slap. And we think, and we play the game, and we're like, oh, well, my grandmother, I mean, she lived till 98, and she didn't have sunscreen back in the day, and we probably come from her line of skin that, it's probably fine. So you play this game. Or it's like smoking. It's like, nah, I know this one bloke who lived to near 100, and he smoked. I could be maybe one of those people that could smoke throughout my life and not get any kind of consequences as a result to my lungs, mouth, throat, toes. You know the pictures on the packets of cigarettes? You probably don't. You've probably never seen them. But I have seen the packets, and I had a friend who was a smoker, and we went into a news agency or a shop one time to get a pack of cigarettes for him, and they said, which one do you want? And he all said, I'll have the gangrene one, thanks. I don't really like the other ones. And I'm staring at that, and I'm laughing, but feeling very awkward, going, oh, that's so weird. Yeah, pick the consequence you want. Now, there is some pain and suffering that happens because of the choices that we make relationally. How we relate in a relationship can result in contributing to the kind of pain or suffering we might experience when a relationship doesn't go good. The reality is, whenever that consequence or that pain or that suffering emerges in your life, it's a God, please don't let this happen kind of prayer moment, right? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? That where we realize we've foolishly made choices or decisions, and maybe we were even naive. Maybe we did things we didn't realize what the consequences were going to be, but nevertheless, those consequences happening. It's this kind of principle works both for good and bad of sowing and reaping. And life's kind of crazy sometimes around, we look at some people and we think, well, look what they sowed and they didn't reap the consequence. But then we sowed just a little bit and we got a full load of consequence, which we feel like feels unfair. Well, we got some things that someone else didn't get. And there's no simple answers to this. So that's one type of pain and suffering. Then there's the type of pain and suffering that's external to us, is out of our control, has nothing to do with our choice. It may be someone else makes a choice and it impacts on you. Someone behaves badly towards you and it has a profound impact on your quality of life. And there's a scale in the level of suffering that could take place as a result of someone else's choices in your life. Maybe there's the kind of pain and suffering that takes place with freak accidents and with nature in the world. Just this week, we heard the story in the news about some people who had won a court case and they went to celebrate on their super yacht in Italy, and a freak storm came, one of those water spouts, kind of like a tornado, twistery type thing over the water, and it came and the boat sunk and a bunch of people lost their lives, including the people who had just won their court case. You go from one moment of utter relief in your situation or circumstances to extraordinary pain and suffering in the next. And it doesn't appear, at least at the moment, that this was any one of their individual faults as far as we're aware. This was a crazy thing that happened. You will remember some years back, we had the tsunami that wiped out hundreds of thousands of people. My brother Dan works for a missions organization and he went to Indonesia after this event had taken place. And I remember looking at his photos and seeing boats kilometers in from where the sea normally was, and hearing the stories of the tragedy and the trauma. Sometimes when we hear about shootings, Trace and I just visited Port Arthur the other day in Hobart. It's my first time ever to Hobart. And going to a place of historical significance in Australian history, learning about what happened to our Indigenous people, learning about what happened to convicts, and then also at the same time remembering the tragedy that took place when 35 people lost their lives. But there were also many others who were injured and wounded. who have had to live with that pain and that suffering in their life, that trauma, including their friends and their family. And so when we think about the complexity and the diversity of pain and suffering, it raises the obvious questions that philosophers and theologians and regular everyday people like me and you have been asking throughout the ages. Why does this happen? And so we revert to all kinds of philosophy and thinking. And one of the common ways of thinking, both in religious circles and even outside of religious circles, even though it is a religious type of thinking, is this idea of karma. Or the idea that if something bad happens to you, it's because you did something bad. And the gods are getting their vengeance or issuing their punishment on you for what you did. And so we live in fear because we wonder at what moment will we actually reap the consequence for those things that we have done. And it's a terrible way to live. And Christians aren't immune from that way of thinking because I've seen it, I've lived it, I've thought it too. And sometimes you get different theologies that kind of emphasize different aspects of things. The idea that we may be cursed or our family is cursed because of the sins of those who have gone before us brings up all kinds of questions and confusion. And then the obvious, well, how do you avoid it? And even worse, why is it that bad things happen to good people? And the simple theological answer we just give to all those people is, well, no one's good. So you kind of deserve it anyway, like the rest of us. Everyone has sinned. Everyone has done the wrong thing. And so there's this myriad of complexity. And do you know what I've realized? No one's answers, philosophy, theology, helped me at all in my times of pain and suffering. Because it didn't take it away. It's very quiet in here. Let me read to you from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verse 36. And it says, "Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.' And he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, and he began to be grieved and agitated." Gethsemane is a really interesting place. It has historical and religious significance for us and for many people. The word Gethsemane comes from the Aramaic word which means press, literally meaning the oil press. And the name reflects the garden likely contained an olive tree and an olive press, as it was located on the Mount of Olives, an area that was known for its olive trees and its oil production. We have a couple of photos you'll see here of the Garden of Gethsemane today. And in the following photo, we have a picture of a traditional oil press. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. But I want to begin by saying, I want to share with you today 5 reflections about pain and suffering. They are not answers. They are not quick fix solutions. They are not formulas. They are things for us to ponder and reflect as we try to navigate what does it mean for us to come to terms with pain and suffering in our life? What is the purpose? And how do we live with this? In verse 38, it goes on in this passage and says, "Then he said to them, 'My soul is deeply grieved.'" Jesus says to his disciples who were right with him, "Even to death." And he says to them, "Remain here and stay awake with me." This is a person, our Savior, fully human, fully God, who in this moment of distress says to his friends, I want you to remain here. I want you to be with me. And I want you to stay awake with me. But he tells them vulnerably what's happening. He literally says to them, my soul is deeply grieved. The first reflection this morning is it's really important for us to acknowledge when we are suffering and we are struggling, what is actually happening within us. To name the emotions, as Jesus models for us here. He tells his disciples that he's grieved. He is aware that what he is about to go through, because of his teaching, because of what he's been doing in undermining the religious system of the day, threatening, speaking truth to power, to all the authorities, he's seen as a threat. He knows this. And his teaching is radical. And it's showing up those who are in power and the hypocrisy of how they're living their lives, and people are angry. And he is aware that he will suffer as many have suffered before him. He was aware because the Roman Empire made it very clear. When you walked the streets in the empire where they were, they would stick crosses up along the roads and people would be executed, and that would be a sign and a symbol to demonstrate the power and the might and the brutality of the Roman Empire. And that if you cross them, or if you do anything to undermine their definition of peace in their empire, you can be assured there will be serious consequences. Jesus once said to his disciples, in this world, you will have trouble. That's a fact. We're going to experience pain and trouble. John Mark Comer in his book says, pain and suffering are inevitable in this life. Often when we begin to practice the disciplines, or we might say the habits of, or the practices we've been talking about in this series, of what it means to be formed in the way of Jesus, he says the unhealed wounds of a lifetime can rise to the surface of our hearts. Everything in us wants to run in the opposite direction. That's a pretty normal, common response. That's what I do. When things get painful, I'm like, whew, all right, time out. Let's get out of here. Let's go play golf. Let's go pick up the guitar. Let's go, do something else rather than have to sit and reflect and to work out what is happening in me. He says everything in us wants to run in the opposite direction, to deny, to detach, or to even drug our pain. But the invitation of Jesus is to meet him in our pain and to let it become the crucible of our formation. In other words, the journey of how we experience and how we respond to the pain and the suffering that is in our life in different seasons or perhaps throughout our life. Some people experience a lot of pain throughout their life, sometimes physical pain, sometimes emotional pain. Sometimes we go through seasons of it. And it's easy for us when we slow down and we become quiet before God is to do those three things that John Mark Comer says. He says we'll deny it. We're just like, it's not real. We don't think about it. Or we detach. Or we medicate ourselves. And I think it's very important that we never ever judge anyone for doing any one of those three things. Because whenever anyone is doing this, all this is their human response to trying to make sense of something that feels overwhelming to them. And it should cause us to be compassionate to anyone who becomes addicted to any substance or any activity that initially brings relief mentally, physically, or emotionally, but we know can end up causing other problems and other trials and even further pain and suffering in our life, which is why we all cheer each other on to say, let's avoid these things that we want to medicate ourselves with, because there is another way. But you know what? When someone else hasn't yet found that other way, our only response as Jesus followers to them is to be compassionate, to be gracious as God has been gracious to us, and to serve and love and journey with them as they find their way in healing and restoration from the thing that they were trying to deal with, the pain that was deep inside. The Jesus way is to meet God in our pain. Verse 39 of the text says, and going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground. Can you imagine this? You see the moment. Jesus is in the garden. He's with his friends. He's shaken. He says to them, please, this is a vulnerable person. Please stay with me and stay awake. And then he goes on further and he falls to the ground. This is the posture of a person who is desperate, who feels overwhelmed. I will never forget conducting the funeral of one of my best friends' brother. Should never have to do this because he suffered from the medication that he used to deal with the pain that had happened in his life. And I will never, ever lose the image in my mind as I stood at the front of this chapel and as I said the closing words of the funeral. And his mum in front of me that I'd known since I was a child fell off her seat onto the ground, crying out in mourning and grief. This was a highly competent, very intelligent woman who was not given to over-emotionalism, but this was raw grief as she had to stand and see her son be buried. Just so happens that this week, Therese and I went to an art gallery where this dear friend of mine, I had no idea, had an art installation called Funeral Songs. And as I was reflecting on all and thinking about this message and going, wow. And he, every 5 years, films himself singing these songs that are connected to this story and this journey of his life. And I can't help but think, when I see someone fall to the ground, may my heart be full of mercy and kindness, for there may be a day, and I will actually tell you there has been a day, where I have fallen on the ground. It wasn't in front of others, it was by myself. But when that moment of falling on the ground happens, this is a moment of vulnerability. And Jesus prays, he says, my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Let this cup pass from me. The cup, what is the cup about? Well, there's two ways to think about this. In the ancient Near Eastern culture, a cup could symbolize one's fate or destiny, particularly when it involved suffering or judgment. And to drink from a cup was often used metaphorically to mean experiencing something fully, especially in terms of enduring hardships or the consequences of one's actions. This imagery of drinking from a cup was a common way of describing or accepting one's lot in life. But then there's the religious or even the Jewish tradition understanding of the cup, which had very specific connotations related to God's judgment in the Hebrew Scriptures. In Isaiah 51, it speaks of the cup of God's wrath, a metaphor for the severe judgment that would come upon God's people or the people due to their disobedience. The cup of trembling in this context is something terrifying and overwhelming, something one would wish to avoid at all costs. And in this moment, Jesus, the Son of God, says, God, please let this cup pass from me. I think that's a legitimate prayer to pray. Do you? Sometimes we want to be religiously tough. But I think it's a normal response, and the Psalms are full of it. Lord God, please, do not let me have to go through this suffering. And do you know what? isn't it the most incredible thing when the cup passes? Have you ever had a moment where you thought you were going to die and then you got a positive result? And you're like, phew. I remember praying this prayer when I was young. I went for tests. The doctor was straight up with me. He said, we need to test for this. I did what everyone does. I Googled it. The doctor said, please don't Google this. I Googled it. I read the information wrong. I panicked. I stressed for 2 weeks waiting for results. The results came back. And the whole time I'm not saying, God, let this cup pass from me. I'm saying, please, God, please, I'll do anything. I'll go to the end, I'll go to the country no one wants to go. You say all those prayers? You've never done that. And then you get the good news. Oh, it's fine. It's just this. And you're like, the relief. And when things resolve in our lives, or when pain passes, or suffering is lessened, or over time we restore from difficulty in our life, it's an amazing thing. But sometimes that prayer goes unanswered. And here we have Jesus saying, let this cup pass from me. And then look at the following words. He says, yet not what I want, but what you want. In other words, he's saying, God, and this is our second reflection today, I surrender. In other words, this is out of my control. There's what I desire and what I wish and what I hope for. And then there's, how am I going to do with this? And there comes this moment where we surrender and we say, I can do nothing but trust you. Your will be done. And I have had to do that a number of times in my life. When I was 17, when I just finished my HSC, my parents sat me down and let me know that they were separating, which was hard for me to get my head around, even though I was aware something was going on for a while. Because all I remembered was being in the car park on the way out of church and a family leaning into our car to tell my parents, we wish we had a family like yours. And we want a marriage like your marriage. And I held on to that as a young teenager. And that's how I viewed my family and my life. But then that all changed. And I remember going through this first stage of suffering, of trying to come to terms with things not being as the way I imagined life would be. And as I shared with you before, when I was 18 years of age, and I was in my first year at college, and we had to write down where we saw ourselves 10 years from now. So I'm 28 years of age. And I don't know that at 28 years of age, what's about to happen in my life is going to be the next major dark night of the soul season of my life. Where I'm going to walk into church one day and remember that a week before, I was married to someone who was standing next to me on the front row at the church. And on this day, there is an announcement being made that something very painful and difficult has taken place. And I had to walk through the journey of confusion, of betrayal, of doubt. And I'm telling you, that next couple of years felt like the longest season of my life. And I've shared with you before, but if you haven't heard me say this, I pray. I used to pick up my guitar and sing old choruses from when I was a kid in my room. And I would sing these old words like, Jesus is my rock, and turn your eyes upon Jesus, and all these things. And I'd sing them in my room. But really the cry as I was on the floor of my room, metaphorically, and one time literally, was, when is the sun going to rise again? Anyone know what I'm talking about? And because it just felt like this is going forever. And I couldn't see ahead. But one day, the sun rose again. Happened at 9:20 on a Thursday night when I pulled up at a set of traffic lights. And the girl on the front row here was sitting in the car who happened to be my high school sweetheart. And that began the journey of a very, very good thing in my life and God's extraordinary grace in my life. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. But that is not everyone's story. And then we went through the process of having to come to terms with what it means to parent a child who has additional needs, our youngest. And do you know what I'm realizing? I went into denial. I tried to detach. I haven't tried drugs. But I will tell you, sometimes I've had a beverage where I thought, I really want this to resolve the stress. But there's only one thing that liberates me, and it's surrender. Because things feel out of my control. And there's one, and I don't know how to do it. I reach my limits. And my pride says, I don't want others to know this. I don't want to tell my friends, stay with me, stay awake with me, and fall on the ground in front of them. I don't want to do that. But in this series, we're being invited to be with Jesus, to be like Jesus, to become like him, to be formed in his way. And that means sometimes I have to fall on the ground and allow someone else to minister to me in ways that Jesus' own disciples couldn't do for him. We read in the following scriptures, it says that he found his disciples sleeping, and he said to Peter, so you couldn't stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray, that you may not come into the time of trial. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, he went away for the second time and he prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. Again, he came and he found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. And so leaving them again, he went away and he prayed for the third time, saying the same words. And then he came to the disciples and he said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? I wonder if there was sarcasm in that. Now the hour is at hand, he says, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. Look, my betrayer is at hand. And this is when Jesus is confronted by Judas and those who will be with him. The third reflection is community. We need community. Who do you need around you in your times of suffering and pain? And to flip the question, how can you be with those in suffering in ways that Jesus' own disciples failed to be to him? And when others are suffering, it's so important that we remember these tips. Don't offer uninvited advice. Don't assume that your pain and experience is the same as someone else's, even if similar. And ask this question in your own words. But what does support or care look like for you at this moment? These words from friends of mine to me were like balm to my soul. Comforting, encouraging, uplifting. The fourth reflection is this dynamic of spiritual growth that takes place as we go through pain and suffering. And we ask ourselves, we know that this olive press in this Garden of Gethsemane would actually crush the olives and the oil would be pressed out. And then they would gather this initial pulp and they would put it in these baskets, and then they would place them under another press and they would push down heavy, and there would be a heavy weight. And the very first oil to come out of that is the extra virgin olive oil, the most beautiful oil. And it just reminds me of the fact that when the weight comes on our lives, this is what forms us and shapes us. And God has an incredible ability to shape us in our pain and suffering. And so we should be asking ourselves, what do I need to learn? And how am I seeing the world differently? I sat out in the cafe one day with a man who poured his heart out to me, vulnerably, when I met him at a children's event here. And he told me about his situation with one of his children that was incredibly stressful. And I remember sitting there for an hour and a half and thinking to myself, years ago, I would have bailed out of this conversation after half an hour. But how God has shaped me and is still forming me as I go through the challenges in my life and as I learn what it means to be a parent in some challenging circumstances. God is bringing about compassion and empathy in ways that probably couldn't have happened without my own experience of pain and suffering. And finally, the fifth reflection is the place of redemptive suffering, where God takes our pain and our suffering, and He uses it for His purposes. He doesn't necessarily bring it into our life. He doesn't wish it upon us. But when pain or suffering takes place in our life, God has an incredible ability of working in us by His Spirit to bring resurrection life, to bring newness and purpose out of what is pain and suffering. And if you look at the photo of this man on the picture, some of you will recognize him as the famous Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who under his care, 20,000 women who were suicidal, none of them ended up taking their lives, and he was able to help the majority of them in profound ways. And he formed a theory called logotherapy, sometimes called meaning therapy, and it was based around these three big ideas that if a person has a vision for their future or a project to work on, something to focus on, and if they have a community around them, perhaps of unconditional love or of care, and then if they had a redemptive view of suffering, they could find purpose even when they've gone through hell. The kind of hell that he experienced himself as he went through the Auschwitz prison camp that the Nazis established. And he happened to be one of the few survivors and had asked the question, what good could possibly come from such evil and hatred? But he knew that there is always a way to turn something so painful into something good that can bless and can help and bring hope to others. And so I finished this morning by saying this: your oil can be used to bless and help others. Jesus was crushed. The weight of the world's sin and violence and hatred came upon him, the consequences of sin. But through his suffering and his pain, God brought about salvation and healing and restoration for many. And He can do the same in you and me. Whatever you're going through, whatever has happened, God can use it. And that oil can bring healing and hope and nourishment to somebody else.
Thanks again for joining us for the Good Life podcast. I really appreciate your support. If you want to find those extra resources, they're at practicingtheway.org. As always, I really appreciate the support by following us on social media or giving us a 5-star review. I hope you have a great week. Peace.